Number 1. Back in 2004, the unthinkable happened for Clemente Aguirre, who was sentenced to death for a double homicide. This Honduran immigrant was accused of murdering his neighbors, Cheryl Williams and her mother, Carol Barris. The victims were found murdered in their home with multiple stab wounds. The prosecutor's case against Aguirre was pretty much circumstantial based on evidence and testimony from the witnesses, who were sketchy at best. On June 25, 2004, Aguirre was charged for the crime. However, he claimed he only found the bodies of the victims and he was only trying to help them. This turned out to be a death sentence for him. He protested an innocence through the trial and throughout his conviction, but no one listened. His case was riddled with questionable eyewitnesses, lack of physical evidence, and poor representation. Despite all this, though, he was still convicted. And during his 14 years on death row, Aguirre always maintained his innocence. Then, evidence started to arise about Samantha, Cheryl's daughter. Evidence such as Samantha's blood was discovered near her mother's body and leading to the bathroom. Not only that, but Samantha was behaving erratically, proclaiming that she killed her own mother. That wasn't all, though. Apparently, years before the murders, Samantha had been heard around the town threatening to kill her mother, and finally, when the truth came out through affidavits, she admitted to killing her own mother and grandmother. She was eventually convicted. Finally, in 2018, after serving over 14 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Clemente Aguirre is released from prison and becomes a free man once again. There is no way for Aguirre to reclaim the time he lost, but at least he can get on with his life and work towards his future. He was more than overjoyed with finally getting his freedom back. Number 2. In 2007, a 14-year-old boy was facing 37 to 90 years for a quadruple murder he didn't commit. The teenager, Devonte Sanford, was just walking outside his home on a summer night when he was arrested only blocks away from where 4 people had been murdered by an AK-47. While he was only 14 years old at the time of his arrest, he went on to be convicted of the murders, which made him the youngest person to be sentenced to life in prison in the state of Michigan. His conviction was mostly made up of false testimony and coerced confessions. Eventually, a new investigation was sparked with the Michigan Innocence Clinic and the Wayne County's prosecutor's office, which determined that the sentence would be overturned. While basically Sanford, given his young age, was forced into confessing to the murders, there was still a glimmer of hope that he could be released, as most of the community felt he was not the suspect. The investigation went on to uncover evidence that placed someone else besides Sanford at the scene of the crime. This evidence pointed to Rayvon Brantley as the prime suspect in the murders. Eventually, Brantley went on to confess to the crime, as well as providing key evidence, including the location of the murder weapon. After all this new material came to light, there was nothing to do but to release Sanford. Brantley went on to be sentenced and is serving 37 to 80 years behind bars. Either way, I think it's safe to say he's never getting out. Sanford, since his release in 2016, has gone on to adapt to society and even pursued a college degree, where he could speak about his experience in the criminal justice system. He made it his mission to make up for the time lost and fight for those who are currently in the position where he once was. It looked like he might be starting his life over and looking forward to happier times. Despite his noble efforts, Devonte was arrested for assault in 2018, and this time he was the guilty party. Number 3. Back in 1991, Gregory Counts and Van Dyke Perry were sentenced to life in prison for a crime that they would later be found not guilty of committing. The victim was surely convinced that it was Counts, Perry, and another unknown man who were her assailants. It wasn't until 2017, though, that the Innocence Project decided to look into the case. And after testing new DNA samples, it discovered that Counts and Perry were not responsible for the crime. It turns out that the real culprit was actually deceased. With more evidence being discovered and more DNA testing being done, eventually the truth came to light, which was quite the discovery. Apparently, The real person who was responsible for assaulting the victim was her own boyfriend at the time. It seems the boyfriend was in debt to Counts and Perry, and he forced his girlfriend to say that she was kidnapped and raped by Counts and Perry. Well, after nearly 30 years behind bars, Counts and Perry were finally released. After the new DNA evidence proved them innocent, and the victim finally came forward and owned up to her false claims, she sure took her sweet time coming forward to give these two men the tears of joy that they waited so long for. Number 4. It's the summer of 1993, and a gruesome murder takes place in New Jersey. 22-year-old Tito Marino is stabbed to death while working at his family's video store. With no solid evidence of who the murderer was, the police pinned the crime on Eric Kelly and Ralph Lee through coercion and sketchy eyewitnesses. The two men were convicted and sent to more than 24 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. Then, the Innocence Project took a look into their case and started to see that these two were most likely framed for the murder. While the state was sticking to their guns about Kelly and Lee being guilty, the Innocence Project, however, decided to dig a little deeper into it. Eventually, the two men were cleared of the crime when DNA from a green plaid baseball cap that was found at the scene of the crime and believed to be worn by the killer did not match the DNA of either Kelly or Lee. After years of fighting to be released, Kelly and Lee were granted a court order to conduct new DNA testing from the crime scene, which wound up proving their innocence. Finally, in 2017, a new trial was ordered and the two men awaited that retrial. However, in 2018, the Passaic County prosecutor decided not to retry the case, and the two men were set free. Upon being released and tasting that sweet smell of freedom, both men filed lawsuits against Patterson police officers for fabricating evidence, coercing their confessions, and not disclosing information that would have shown that they were not guilty of murder. They were seeking up to $48 million in compensation each. While Kelly and Lee did receive $1 million apiece in settlements from the state of New Jersey from a separate lawsuit, that $48 million lawsuit is still waiting to go to court. As you can imagine, the state of New Jersey is probably not at all that willing to cough up almost $100 million anytime soon. Number 5. This story has an unusual ending when it comes to the wrongfully convicted Juan Catalan. In 2003, he was accused of murdering 16-year-old Martha Puebla, who was a witness in the case of a gang slaying outside of her home. She was shot and killed, and 3 months later, the FBI arrested Catalan for the murder. It appeared that the FBI had found their guy with all the evidence they were racking up against Catalan. All through the trial, though, he maintained his innocence. This is where the case starts to turn in Catalan's favor. He remembered that the day of Puebla's murder, he was at a Dodgers game with his daughter. Not only that, but it just so happened that Larry David, the creator of Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm, was shooting an episode in the same row where Catalan was sitting. After Catalan's lawyers got a hold of the footage, they were able to prove his alibi and get him cleared of the murder charges. The two detectives in the case were both found guilty of falsifying their reports and coercion. For Catalan, talk about catching the break of a lifetime. After months of incarceration, he was able to walk out a free man and get back to raising his daughter. There was even a Netflix documentary produced in 2017 about his case, titled Long Shot, which sums up exactly how Catalan came to prove his innocence, a long shot. I'm sure Catalan sees Larry David as his guardian angel after that day at Dodgers Stadium.